Let's continue our discussion by looking at the cerebrum. Now remember, the cerebrum is what makes up the bulk of the brain. This is the largest portion by far. It is composed of two hemispheres. You can see that there is a right and a left hemisphere, and within each one of these hemispheres there are lobes in the positions and with the names of the flat bones of the skull, which you've seen before. So in each one of these hemispheres there are frontal lobes right up to the front. There are parietal right behind them, occipital to the back, and then laterally on either side you'd have the temporal lobes. And deep inside the lateral sulcus there's another one called the insula, what's sometimes called the fifth lobe, which is very seldom ever shown. But looking at some of these sulcine fissures, these are little cracks and depressions. Some of them have proper names. Now the longitudinal fissure we looked at before, that's what separates the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. There's a lateral fissure on the side that separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal. There's a central sulcus that separates the frontal and parietal. So those are just specific grooves with names. Remember, what they separate are different lobes and other structures. And looking at the surface of the cerebrum, you can always see these gyri and sulci. Sulci are any of these little cracks or depressions you see on the surface. The gyri are the elevations, the folds in between them. That makes the surface of the cerebrum very convoluted, meaning very wavy. That increases surface area and gives more room for neurons, axons, and any other structures. And again, remember, with many things in the body, you'll see regions like an outer cortex and a deeper inner medulla. And you will see that with the brain too. So continuing here, the central sulcus we mentioned before separates the frontal and parietal lobes, also separates the motor and sensory cortex. Motor cortex where you have conscious control over skeletal muscle. That somatic sensory cortex where you perceive many different types of sensations. So we looked at the frontal lobe before. It's anterior up to the front of the cerebrum. Again, we have that motor cortex, so there's voluntary motor function, but also motivation, aggression, sense of smell, and mood are in this region. The parietal lobe, which is right back behind it, gives you reception and evaluation of much sensory information, except for smell, hearing, and vision. So a lot of it is found sensory in this parietal lobe. The occipital lobe to the back is where you have your visual input. That's part of the brain actually lets you see things. And then here with the temporal lobes on the side, you've got reception and evaluation for smell and hearing. So there's a couple of your specific sensations there. And then memory, abstract thought, judgment, and that insula, that sometimes mentioned fifth lobe, is within this region right here. Going back to the cerebral medulla, remember there's outer cortex and deeper inner medulla. In this region where we see more of the white matter. Remember, that's where you've got the myelin sheath, which is lipids around axons. But also in this area, you have these three different types of fibers. And what these are axon pathways. And what's really different about the three is the direction in which they're traveling. So if you look at the association fibers, they are connections within the same hemisphere. So think of those as running anterior, posterior, front, and back, connecting different lobes and regions of one hemisphere of the cerebrum. The commissural fibers connect one hemisphere to another. So those run left and right. That way the two halves can communicate with each other. And then there's projection fibers, which project inferior and superior, allowing communication with the cerebrum and the spinal cord. So three different directions with those right there. You can see below that the basal nuclei. These are found in the cerebrum, diencephalon, and midbrain, so several different regions of the brain. These have to do with motor function control. And these nuclei in the cerebrum, some of those like the caudate and the lentiform, are also called the corpus striatum, just another name for those. Looking at the limbic system within the cerebrum. Here you have basic survival functions. Things like memory, reproduction, and nutrition are located in this area. Below that, we see the meninges of the brain. Now you'll see these meninges, these connective tissue layers around brain and spinal cord. Now before you even get to the first layer, looking at the superficial ones first, outside of that first layer in the skull, there's an epidural space. Again, epi means outer. So outside, superficial to the first layer, the epidural space is the first little region that we see when you go deep in from the skull. But our first meninge is called the dura mater, a very big, thick, tough outer layer. So it's the most superficial, very thick, very tough, and very strong. So that's the one that's actually closest to the bones that are found in your skull. Just deep to that dura mater, there's a space called the subdural space. Again, epi was outside of it, sub is beneath it. Here you'll find a little bit of serous fluid, not much of anything else there. But beneath, deep to the dura mater, you'll find the second meninge called the arachnoid mater. Somebody thought under a microscope the connective tissue strands look a little like a spider web, and that's where arachnoid came from in its name. Just deep to it is the subarachnoid space. There's a lot of material in this subarachnoid space. Lots of blood vessels and cerebrospinal fluid are in this region. And then third and lastly of the meninges, you got the pia mater. This deepest layer is bound tightly to the surface of the brain itself. Now let's take a look at the ventricles. These ventricles are these fluid-filled cavities and spaces deep inside your brain. Now there's 4 of them altogether. First of all, there's 2 lateral ventricles. So there's a lateral one on the left and there's a lateral one on the right. Now when cerebrospinal fluid wants to leave those 2 lateral ventricles, it's going to have to travel down through a little passageway. This little passageway right here is called the interventricular foramen. So that's a hole in between these ventricles, actually the first 2, which are the lateral, and going down to that third one. And here you can see that third ventricle. Where those lateral ventricles are somewhat C-shaped, inside of that C is where you'll find that third ventricle. Now for cerebrospinal fluid to get out of that third ventricle, it's got to go down through a little passageway. This little passageway is called the cerebral aqueduct, and that'll lead down to the 4th ventricle, which is at the base of the cerebellum. You may have seen that in some previous videos. So there's 4 ventricles altogether, a couple of connections allowing this fluid to get out of this region. And once that cerebrospinal fluid leaves that last 4th ventricle, it's going to go down through the center of the spinal cord, back up around it and the brain. Now look at that a little bit further along. But looking at the cerebrospinal fluid, it's very similar to fluid you see in the blood and such, but there aren't as many proteins in it. And again, it does bathe and surround the brain and spinal cord. Around your brain and spinal cord, and especially the brain, it makes a nice little fluid cushion. That way if you get hit hard on your head, hopefully that fluid doesn't let your brain impact the inside of the skull so hard. So it helps to protect it in that way there. You'll also find in this region a choroid plexus. Now here's one of the regions where that cerebrospinal fluid is made. This will fill those ventricles and other parts of the brain and spinal cord itself. And there's lots and lots of epidermal cells in this region. These are the cells, technically they're epithelial cells, which make this cerebrospinal fluid. That fluid again makes a nice little fluid cushion shock absorber around the brain and spinal cord. Also helps to bring nutrients to these cells too. But there's also in this region a blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier. These little endothelial cells have many proteins called tight junctions which bind them tightly together. That's not going to let much of anything get in between the cells, and cells are always very picky about what they allow to go through them. That's going to help to keep harmful materials out of many regions of the brain. You want to protect those neurons because if you ever lose those, they're not coming back. Lipid-soluble materials can get through cell membranes, and they can do the same here, but other than that, not much is going to get through this barrier.